Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and welcome to today's live stream where we're going to be talking about neuroscience AI. And this is a new space of AI that has been around for quite a while. So it's looking at attention. How do we understand and process attention? And using artificial intelligence to better understand what is the source of attention and what we're paying attention to. So I started following this company, this tiny little startup in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Affectiva back in 2010. That was 13 years ago. And they were putting, again, cameras and using that to understand what people were paying attention to when they were watching the television. And so they've been expanding and using a lot of the intelligence they've gathered to understand how some of the attention works. And so there are many, many multiple companies doing that today. And I wanted, and then I was looking at studying AI, as some of you may know, over the past couple of weeks. And I was looking around my company, PA Consulting, and I realized that there was this area called neuroscience AI. And this guy called Scott Siegel is looking at this and helping clients with it. So I called up Scott and said, "What are you doing in this space?" So I thought I would invite him on to the show today. So Scott, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening.
Great. So Scott, you're in New York today. So hope the weather isn't too bad there. It is not that warm here either. So I think you actually may be warmer in New York than in San Francisco.
We're going to get to a balmy 70 degrees today, but at least the sun is shining, so it's beautiful.
Oh yeah, it's definitely warmer there today than it is here. So give a quick introduction about who you are and what you do at PA Consulting.
Perfect. Pleasure to meet everyone today. I'm Scott Siegel, so nice to meet everyone. I'm within our data and analytics, or data science and analytics practice, and I focus on our emerging technologies. So a lot of time spent in AI and all those things that you look at this, that you can say, what is going to make my life easier? How can I apply AI? How can I make it more predictive to help me in my life? That is me. So anything along those new technologies, as Charlene said, I usually get a call, and then here we are today.
Yeah, Scott gets to play with all the new fun things. So talk a little bit about what you do when it comes to this neuroscience AI. Why did you start looking at it? What is it?
So when we look at that and we talk today on neuroscience AI, what is the first thing we want to do when we have an interaction, any successful interaction? We need to get attention, right? And as we talk about, right, whether we're looking on mobile apps, whether we're in an actual physical store, video, how do we gather the attention? Because that's the most meaningful thing in order to tell the narrative of what we want our customers or the people that we're speaking to understand. Attention is the first step. And all of our attention exists within a context. When we look at today, we're existing in the context of the computer, right? So I'm looking at the computer, I'm in an office, but my attention is focused on the computer in the context, for those of you that have been to New York City, and all the other stimuli that are going around the world today, and the floors below me with the sirens and everything. So how do we measure or quantify the attention as we look to discuss and interact with individuals and customers? So that was how this product was born.
Okay, great. So I just have a prompt here also as well to ask people, what captures your attention? What do you notice when you walk into a store or walking down the street? What captures it? Is it attention? Is it motion? So is it colors? Is it motion? And just give us an idea of what you pay attention to, because we'll incorporate that into the discussion as we go along here. And of course, if you have any questions, I'll try to get to them as much as possible. And feel free to grill Scott as much as you like. Right?
Absolutely. We may want a baseline, and if we want to pull up possibly just a quick slide to baseline, let's define what is attention and why does attention matter? That'll be our first discussion, right? What does that mean? And really and we touched on it briefly earlier today, we are all very busy people, whether you're in San Francisco, Dallas, Texas, New York City, we are saturated for competing items with our attention. I'm on the cell phone. My children may be coming to get me while I'm working. Any one of those things, or I'm in the supermarket, and we see lights flashing, things coming to us. So we're in a saturated marketplace. So how do we measure that attention? And we know that attention, or content with higher attention, we have a better likelihood of focusing that. Remember, attention is those first few things biologically that we're going to focus on within the first few seconds. And then from there, we can either nurture that relationship or we would move on. But how do we get that attention? And one thing to note is our algorithm is a biological algorithm. So I'm confident many of you have heard of eye tracking movements, right? We'll all go into a room, they'll place wonderful devices on our heads, and they're going to measure our eye tracking. That is one type, but that's what I call a little bit more of a heritage. We use a biological algorithm. So a lot of fancy words here, but really there's the visual cortex of the human brain. And this, we don't have time to go into all the wonderful things, but of that within the human brain, we have the visual cortex, right? And we're going to look at saliency, luminescence, motion, color, and we replicate those 5 areas biologically within the human brain of how attention is captured. It's also important to note that regardless of where you grew up, whether you grew up in Asia, New York City, the Middle East, Africa, right, within the spectrum, all humans process the initial first few seconds of attention the same way. So this is how we're able to apply this. And we call our product Ready to Go. It's not really this, but attention out of the box. There's no machine learning. We've already determined biologically through our biological algorithm how we're going to look for attention in the first 1 to 5 seconds.
And so, and I assume the way that we're wired to look at attention doesn't necessarily change that much over time.
Correct. Biologically, we've just been wired this way for millions of years, evolutionary. And so I'm confident this will be good for the next 1,000 years at least.
Well, I want to get into your slides a little bit more. Let's go on to the next one because you have some great and stunning visuals here that explain this a little bit more. So what is attention actually? What are you measuring when you look at this?
So it's really what grabs my attention first. And when we look at this, right, visual attention is not about what we recognize. And I think this is a very important point for our conversation. It's what we see first. So if you were to go into a museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or you like to go to the Smithsonian, right, there's a bunch of stimuli that you look at. There'll be a bunch of pictures, photographs that you may or may not recognize. But how those photographs are assembled, and it could be a store display, an e-commerce site, right, video, however we choose to look at it, it's what our eye or it's what our brain registers first in the overall context of everything else. So for example, when you look, so I'm in New York, so I will use the New York versions today. When I'm walking on the street and I see a billboard, right, that billboard exists in a certain context, but is my eye drawn to the appropriate things within that billboard or that video billboard and so forth? So that is attention, not what we recognize if we walk away from anything else today, but what we see first. And again, it's a biological function that we see in those first few seconds, or what we've called here the 0 moment of truth, because I'm either going to focus on it and you've invited me in, or I will continue walking.
Right. So just to be really explicit, how are organizations using this tool? And then we'll get into what it actually looks and does. But what kind of problems are they using to address?
So we're looking to address, is my product standing out, or am I gathering the appropriate amount of attention? So for this example, right, we can walk through a shopping mall or we can walk through a supermarket, and there are multiple products in the supermarket, right, when we take the cart and we're going through and multiple stimuli, right? And you're competing. So we can look, for example, of potato chips. There are multiple manufacturers of potato chips or barbecue sauce or soda. But within the context of all of them, and for the purposes of this discussion, we'll say there are 10 different kinds of barbecue sauce and potato chips on the shelf. Am I going to focus initially, or are you going to have my attention on my brand, Scott Siegel brand of potato chips, in order to invite you in and look to see if you would like to purchase them? So the issue we're solving is in the context of everything. Are you, right, in this case, the consumer, going to focus on me for those first few seconds so I can invite you in to hopefully make a conversion in this instance?
Right. So let's go to the example, which is a great slide here. Why don't you talk a little bit about what these planograms are actually showing?
Perfect. And again, this works on our narrative. We're walking through the store. I'm going to assume everyone has been to the supermarket and seen a relative shelf like this, multiple products going on. So when we look at the left, this is how the retailer has aligned it. And again, there are multiple narratives that can go with this, but for the purposes of this, we see products on the shelf, right? We see cookies, we see barbecue sauce, chips, all various things that we would see in any supermarket in the United States. But now what we want to do is when we look at the right-hand side, we see a heat map. And this is very telling for us. So if we look at the heat map and we're noticing the saliency score on the lower left-hand side, right, we see what I've determined is barbecue sauce is really standing out. And this is what the retailer can monetize. And if you're the owner of Scott Siegel's barbecue sauce, you're very happy because the barbecue sauce is standing out. This is where my attention is focused when I'm looking straight at this particular shelf.
Let's go into the next one, and then I have a couple questions for you. Then this is also an eye tracking. So you can use the AI to anticipate and understand what somebody would be looking at in the order they would be looking at it. So what is this actually showing?
Exactly. So our biological algorithm is looking at our gaze path. So when we as humans look at an area of interest, and we can look at a billboard, we could look at the shelf right here, or even a television program, our eyes are drawn to certain things, and then naturally we will gaze to understand the overall context of where we're at. So this is a very valuable tool, in this case for the retailer of the supermarket, where again, the highest saliency, or the area where I'm going to focus the most, again for the 1 to 5 seconds, is region 1. And region 1 is barbecue sauce, so I'm focused there. So if you wanted to make a sale on barbecue sauce or do some type of predictive analytics on barbecue sauce, this is perfect. And then the rest of it shows where my eyes would track within the overall shelf distribution or product distribution on those shelves. And we can look at it and we apply metrics. And this is very important. So I could look at metrics and I apply the saliency score. Region 1 has the highest saliency. There are 14 primary regions within this overall shelf space. And this is telling me how I, and not just I as Scott, right? I as any one of us on the call today, are going to look at the gaze path and determine where our eyes are going to focus. We can also see that it's a little bit chaotic. So when we were talking earlier, and I used this example, and I'm sure everyone has this friend, sometimes you go into the friend's home and the house just seems busy, or you go into a furniture store and it seems busy. This is part of the reason why. We have a gaze path and it just seems chaotic. We don't know where we are supposed to focus. So this helps enable our focus, provide our attention to where we would like the attention to be applied. And again, in this case, region 1 has the highest saliency region. And then we can see underperforming regions. So we can see barbecue sauce is doing very well, right? If we were chips or crackers, we may not be doing quite as well. So we may want to look to adjust that if we were the chips or crackers manufacturers for that.
Right. This reminds me so much of the eye tracking user interface testing that's been around for over a decade now. We evaluate websites, we look at things on the computer, have people come into the lab and the cameras watching them to see where their eyes look at. That's kind of impractical to do in a retail store with hundreds of thousands of feet of shelf space, right? So you can just take a picture of your shelf, because that's what this is actually analyzing, a picture, and then you can understand what the gaze path looks like. Is that correct?
You are 100% correct. And what's beautiful about this is it doesn't require cameras. I'm not looking at individual people as they're coming through the stores in terms of privacy. I'm not looking at their faces. In this example, I took a picture off the internet, right? Ran it through our algorithm and created these reports. The same thing with video. I can look at video if you wanted to sell a specific beverage, or if you wanted to sell pens and you were making a video commercial for that, we could run that through and indicate the area of interest for that. But absolutely correct. There is no hardware investment required within the store, and we can look at thousands of things very quickly. The other item to note is if, in this example, let's say you were the chip manufacturer and you wanted to go ahead and redesign the shelving space, we could do that with you side by side virtually, of course. So what we'll call the A/B testing, relatively instantaneous, right, as far as two people can be, and say, look, you made these changes, we ran it through the algorithm again, and now you have a better saliency score or a worse saliency score. But we can do multiple what if scenarios. So to your point, I limit the need to involve people to come in and take that time and expense to track their eye movements.
Hmm. Hmm. I have a comment here and question here. Let me see if I can find it from Jay Johnson. This is merely an iteration of hidden persuaders, and this is, I believe, a book that came out that talked about how the advertising industry is trying to subtly manipulate consumers' desire for certain products, and it's something that started emerging in the early 20 to the 1900s. So again, it's a bit nefarious in some ways, but at the same time, this is reality of people trying to understand what's going on. But it's not subliminal.
No,
How do you
it's
think
a
about
very
it?
good question. So there are multiple ways. So this is a great question that I'd love to have a longer discussion on. We are just capturing the attention. So in terms of influencing me or persuading me subliminally to buy barbecue sauce, we are not doing that. We are just saying within the context of everything else, this is where my attention has focused within the first few seconds. Now, the second part of that answer is if the barbecue sauce in this instance has certain words or labels or whatever, that's going to give me a feeling of nostalgia, for example. That's separate. That's the manufacturer, but we are not persuading anyone. We're just quantifying that this is the attention where it's going.
Mhm. So it does that really good thing about A/B testing. So we can arrange yourself this way and that way, instead of having people come in parading constantly by the shelf, which would be impossible to test, right? You could never test and understand that in the same way you could do with eye tracking on a website. So this actually gives you some insights. I'm just starting to realize how people could actually use this technology.
Exactly. We just give the insight of where the attention. And to go back a little bit on the question we had earlier, again, we gather the attention. If we wanted to look, for example, level 2 or extrapolate this further, and there are items that do that, we are not measuring the emotional response. So if we look here within certain cultures, right? So if you live in Iran, you live in China, you live in India, wherever you live, right? There may be certain words or maybe certain colors that evoke an emotional response. We are not judging those in this instance. We're just saying biologically, as we have to breathe, our eyes have to focus, and this is where they focused right here. And then we take that.
Yeah. And so every AI has a problem with it. What's the problem with this AI? Because it's still pretty new. But yeah.
It always comes down to, are we being transparent and not having any type of bias within the results, right? The AI is going to measure, and we've used this example of barbecue sauce on a shelf in the context of blue color in a store on 42nd Street. That's what it's going to do. But if you take the same results and you try to say barbecue sauce is the best thing that everybody in New York City loves to buy, the answer is no, right? Because use it within the context. The AI is not living in a vacuum. And our attention, for the purposes of today, we as humans always exist in the context of something else. So we just have to be transparent in the way we report out those results.
Hmm. And so, for example, looking at that shelf, we're not looking at that shelf constantly, staring at it, right? We're walking by very quickly, milliseconds, looking at that. And this gives us a little bit of insight into what is registering in terms of that person's attention and what
Exactly.
isn't, right?
Exactly. And just to go on that, so if you looked at the shelf, and I don't know how many people focused on it, one of them was trending new items. So it's a perfect thing if you're going to trend a new item. And just as you said, I'm walking by it. I'll have maybe 2 seconds. I'm going to be on my phone talking to my wife to ask her what we need. But if that registered me in the first 2 seconds, that could be then, oh, maybe we do need barbecue sauce. But
Mm.
it got my attention. And now the second step would be invite me to have a meaningful interaction to do
Yeah.
that.
Good. Interesting. Interesting. And you can test whether it's happening or not. Talk to me about how some of this could also be used in other sectors other than retail. I imagine any place where attention is of interest, not just retail and advertising, but my mind is drawn to, for example, education or the workplace, safety notices and bulletins on the walls. What are some of the ways potentially that neuroscience AI could be used?
So you're spot on. We have a client right now that we're working with that are the instructions clear. So when you look at the holiday time, and we've assembled toys for our children, and I don't know about you, but I always end up with extra pieces. So one of our clients is looking at it to say, are the instructions clear? Are we focusing? And we, right, as the manufacturer, are the instructions clear enough that the consumer, myself, are focusing where they need to focus in order to assemble things? But you're correct, in hospitals, in construction sites, anywhere where there's safety, is the eye focusing where it needs to focus in order for the brain to register and synthesize the message that's being there?
Mhm. I
Again,
could, yeah. I can only imagine. I know that when I'm driving, there are signs in multiple. I was just driving through something, an intersection this weekend. There was a railroad crossing in the middle of it. It's fairly new. It was just put in the past few years. And the multiple signs and places and things, it is such a mess. I have no idea what to pay attention to. And this cross traffic company at too as well. So I can imagine there are many different uses for this to see what are the most important things for people to be looking at that particular moment, literally over time and space as you're driving through that intersection.
exactly. And that can't be underestimated because those signs are there to save your life. And if you tune it out from the more stimuli, how are we going to get that attention to make sure we're doing the correct thing?
Hmm. One thing that strikes me is that again, this live stream is really focused on disruptive leaders, and something for leaders to think about is where is attention important in their business, and they could potentially use this. And so everything from being a healthcare provider, again, the safety to education to professional services. If you're creating slides, are people paying attention to the things? And I don't know about you, but consultants tend to put very dense slides up together. So it'd be great to be able to run that through an algorithm very quickly to say, is there enough white space to focus my attention on things? So I guess my question is, how long is it going to take for this to expand, you think? As you look at these new technologies, right now it's very bespoke. You have to come to us, PAs, some other specialized vendors to do this. How quickly is this technology going to evolve? Be more widespread and easier to use, because that's a general trend of technology becomes easier and more easy to adapt.
I think it will be adopted fairly quickly. We use it here. So, to your point, we created a newsletter internally and we ran it through this algorithm to make sure that it was going to communicate the things we wanted to communicate. As humans, right, many of us have reticence when we have to adopt a new technology or our world is going to change. But the basic premise of any successful human interaction is the first step. And what's that first step? Gathering the attention, right? Because without that, you continue to walk by and not be interested. So if we can gather that attention and quantify it, so I do believe it will be rapidly adopted. And there's nothing to be afraid of here or concern because this is just mimicking something we already have. The biological algorithm of attention exists within all of us today. And all of us on this call have that. It's unconscious as breathing because we don't realize it, but it's there. And we've just taken that and tweaked it to say, I can quantify this to say, this is where the attention is focused. So I do believe it will take off exponentially.
Interesting. I have two questions here. One from Marissa. Great to see you, Marissa. One of the eye tracking things that come to mind is conversion copywriters have conversation conversion that copywriters have had to put into websites. Subliminal visuals can be just as important as the words on the page. Any thoughts about that?
So again, it's an excellent question. Words and visuals come together in a context that make a narrative. So as long as we wrap those up and the words and the visuals are where we want to focus. Remember, I'm not going to focus on both of those at the same time. The visual may be what invites me in, and then the words cause me to continue to read and then continue. So if I understand the essence of the question, they exist together. And again, I know I've repeated it. The context is none of us exist alone. We all exist in the context of a specific situation at a specific time.
Yeah. And then Mark has this one question. How has the current crop of LMMs changed the current state of neuroscience AI?
So I will have to get back it's a much broader question. We've attacked neuroscience AI, and there are many neuroscience applications. Right now, we've narrowed our focus to just attention getting.
Hmm.
So it's a broader question that I probably can address right here.
Yeah. And I'm not sure what LMMs are, so I'm not even sure. It's not large language models because that could be what he's would be typing. But there are so many different. So Chat GPT is what Mark is saying. So
Hey,
what's the current crop of the again large language models like Chat GPT? How is that going to impact neuroscience AI? Are they completely separate and different?
So the field of neuroscience AI spans the gamut of multiple things. Um, we have just focused on here the purposes of attention getting and then to extrapolate from a cultural reference standpoint. So if I'm understanding Mark's question a little bit, the way the language model may come out may use charged words, for example. So those will evoke an emotional response, right? The soup is extremely scalding as opposed to hot invokes two different things, even though the words are very similar. Um, but for now, we just invoke the attention.
Yeah. Mark, the one thing I can think about is that, especially with Chat GPT, with GPT-4, the ability for it to create images or to analyze images, you could take an image like that shelf, put it in, feed the neuroscience AI into it, and say, "Here's the shelf. Create a better shelf for me." Right? It could reverse engineer it back in using all of the algorithms to say, make an arrangement to optimize for X
Very true.
attention. So that seems how does that sound, Scott? Is that something feasible that the neuroscience AI can do? Because it's the same data, but it's asking it to be generative instead of just responsive to an
It,
image.
it is. So we would hit the button and it would work its magic, so to speak. And this is the optimal arrangement for, but remember, when we say the optimal shelf arrangement would be for something, barbecue sauce, potato chips, because again, all of those products are competing for your attention. So we would optimize for a somethings.
Yeah, and this is what Christopher Avila says. I think we can use this neuroscience AI to ask the AI to help us put our attention where we need and want it to be, not where companies want it. Does that make sense? Is
Well,
it potentially giving us more control in some ways to say, look, this is how I pay attention coming into the store. This is what I'm looking for. Could it actually help me focus my attention, or to give feedback to the retailer or to the companies to say, I know what you want me to look at, but this is what I want to look at.
it would go for the feedback. Absolutely. Remember, we drive these things. So absolutely.
Mm.
And as I said, I've used it myself internally. We do make a lot of slides and I try to keep everything to 6 slides or less. So am I focused? And I run it through that. Is the attention focused where I need it to for my 6 slides?
Hmm. I might have to go hit you up to get you access to this AI. Great. Well, Scott, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate you spending the time today. And again, I just want to make sure that we'll see that you can see Scott at Scott Siegel, scott.siegel at pfconsulting.com if you have any follow-up questions. And I think you'll be more than happy to talk about that. All right. Thank you, Scott.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Wish everyone a wonderful day and week ahead.
Thank you. And just a quick note about what's happening next week. I'll be talking about some of the new research that we have coming out. It's actually live today. So if you'd like to go and see it, you can see it at this location. I'll put it into the chat too as well, so you have it. This is a new research that we have that looked at consumers in the United States and asked about their attitudes around AI. So if you would like to go take a look at some of that research, you have the Bitly account here, and I'll be going into greater detail about that next Tuesday. It is some information we put out, and we'll have more detailed information about it next week too, launching. But join me for that because it's some interesting findings about what people are excited about, what people are nervous about, but also ways and some recommendations in the research that talks about what organizations can do to assure people that this AI is going to be used in an ethical and responsible way. So something that we've talked about. So thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you again to Scott, who's still online here on the side, for joining us today to talk about this new world of neuroscience AI. And join me again next week. All right, take care, everybody. Talk to you soon.